A man has been gone for 4,800 years, and his bones just changed what we know about who built the pyramids. He sits in a glass case in Liverpool, curled up inside a clay pot, ignored by almost everyone who walks past. For a century, experts argued about one thing: were the pharaohs African or European? In 2025, scientists unlocked his whole genome and found the answer was neither. 1/5 of him traced back to a place nobody expected, the land that later gave us the Anunnaki. He could not tell anyone where he came from. His teeth could. Nowhere at Egypt, a cliff 265 kilometers south of Cairo. In 192, workers cut into the rock and found a tomb. And inside the tomb was a large clay pot, and folded inside the pot was a skeleton, a grown man, buried with care in a way that showed he was someone who mattered. They shipped him to England, where he sat in a museum for more than 100 years while 2 world wars burned through Europe around him. The building where he was kept was bombed. He survived that, too. And nobody knew the most important thing about him until a research team took a sample from one of his teeth and read the code written inside it. The code had a name, NUE00001. It belonged to the first ancient Egyptian whose whole genome has ever been read. To understand why that matters, you have to understand how badly people have wanted to claim him. For 200 years, the question of who gets to own the pharaohs really has been less about science and more about who gets to claim them. One side said ancient Egypt was a black African civilization built by people native to the continent, later taken by European museums and European ideas. The other side said the Egyptians were basically Mediterranean, light-skinned, closer to Greece and Rome than to anything south of the Sahara. The fight got loud. It got personal. It moved out of universities and onto television, into comment sections, into films with dramatic music and very little proof. Both sides pointed to statues. Both sides pointed to paintings. Both sides pointed to skulls measured by men who, to be blunt, had already decided what they wanted to find. What almost nobody had was real genetic material from a real ancient Egyptian. Egypt is hot. Heat destroys DNA. The mummies that lasted were soaked in tree sap and salts that damaged the very building block scientists needed. For decades, the honest answer to the question was that we could not test it. So everyone kept arguing, because an argument you cannot lose is very comfortable to hold. Then, the testing got better. In 2017, a team working out of 2017, and the first Egyptian DNA, the Max Planck Institute, and the University of Tübingen did something that was supposed to be impossible. They pulled usable DNA from a group of mummies at a site called Abu Sir el-Melek in Middle Egypt. 151 people were sampled. Mitochondrial code, the kind passed down through the mother's line, came from 90 of them, and from 3 came the harder prize, full genome data covering both parents. These were not the oldest Egyptians. They ranged from the New Kingdom down into the Roman period, roughly 1400 BCE to 400 of the Common Era, but they were real and they were tested, and the result landed like a slap to both sides. The ancient Egyptians at Abu Sir el-Melek were most closely related to ancient peoples of the Near East, the Levant, Anatolia, the early farming peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, not Central Africa, not Europe. Their closest genetic cousins lived in what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Turkey. This is the detail that everyone missed in the noise. The same study found that modern Egyptians carry about 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than these ancient ones did. Read that the way it was really written. The African genetic signal in Egypt did not get watered down by foreign conquest the way people assumed. It went up later after the pharaohs were already gone. The people who built the temples were more tied in their genes to the Near East than the people living on the same land today. The lead researcher said it plainly. Everyone expected that Greeks and Romans and Persians flooding into Egypt would have made the ancient people look more Eurasian than the modern one. The data showed the opposite. The Father's lines told the same story. The Y chromosome passes from father to son almost unchanged. So it is a clean way to trace a single deep father's line. 2 of the 3 Abu Sir el-Melek men carried a line called J. a line rooted in the Near East and West Asia. The third carried a North African line. 2 doors out of 3 opened to the east. And these were the late Egyptians, the ones standing closest to the time of Greek and Roman rule, the ones who should have looked the most European of all. They did not. Now a fair scientist would raise a hand here, and the researchers raised it themselves. Abu Sur el-Melik is one site. It is in the north. These people were fairly late in Egyptian history. You cannot take 3 genomes from one graveyard and speak for 3,000 years of a whole civilization. The finding was real, but it was a keyhole, not a window. To settle the question of the pharaohs, the ones who raised the pyramids, you would need someone far older, someone from the start. You would need a man in a pot. Liverpool 2025. The skeleton that broke the argument's second result came out, and it did not soften the first one. It blew it apart. The team reading NUE 00001 was not working with a New Kingdom mummy or a Roman era body. Carbon dating put this man between 2855 and 2570 BCE. That is the bridge between Egypt's early dynastic period and the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is the age of the pyramids. King Djoser's Step Pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Giza. This man was alive in the window when Egypt was carving its first mountains of stone out of the desert. He is not near the pharaohs in time. He is standing in the doorway with them, and his genome said something the loud arguments had never planned for. Most of him, roughly 80%, traced to North African Neolithic ancestry, the local farming peoples of the Nile and the land around it. That part fits. That part everyone could have guessed. It is the 20% from the east, the other 20% that shocked the room. 1/5 of this man's ancestry traced to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, to be exact, to genomes standing in for Mesopotamia, the land of the 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the place we now call Iraq, not the Levant next door, the far eastern edge, the heartland where the first cities on earth were rising at almost the very same moment. This was the first time genetics had ever proven fingerprints between Egypt and Sumerit. For years, archaeologists had seen the fingerprints of contact between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Shared art designs, cylinder seals, building methods. The very idea of writing showing up in both places within a few centuries of each other. The usual explanation was trade. Goods moved, ideas moved, people mostly stayed home. That was the safe version, and the safe version just collapsed on a lab table in England. The DNA showed that people themselves had moved, bodies, bloodlines, families. Someone walked or sailed the long road from the land of Sumer into the land of the pharaohs, and they stayed long enough to leave their genes inside a man who would be buried in a clay pot and forgotten for 48 centuries. And once you know the bodies moved, the old clues stop looking like chance. In the centuries right before Egypt joined into a single kingdom, Mesopotamian objects start showing up in Egyptian graves. Cylinder seals, a Sumerian invention, rolled into Egyptian clay. Carved into one of Egypt's earliest royal monuments, the Narmer palette, are 2 long-necked creatures with their necks twisted together, a creature that does not exist in Egyptian art before this moment, but shows up all over Mesopotamian seals. Egyptian builders started raising walls with sunken niched brickwork in a style that had been normal in Sumer for generations. And then, almost at the same moment in both lands, full writing appears. 2 of the only places on earth ever to invent it from scratch, lighting up within a few centuries of each other on opposite ends of the same trade road. Experts had logged every one of these clues. They just kept insisting it was all carried in by traders because the other answer meant admitting that the people of the 2 rivers had reached the Nile in person. The man in the pot is that other answer standing up in a museum case. Then they checked his teeth, what his teeth and bones gave away, and the teeth told a stranger story than the genes alone. The chemistry locked inside tooth enamel records the water and food a person took in while that enamel was forming, which happens in childhood. Test it, and you can often tell where someone grew up. The Nuerat man's teeth said Egypt. He was raised on Egyptian water, Egyptian food, Egyptian soil. He was not an outsider. He was a local, a born and raised Egyptian, whose own body carried woven through it the mark of a people from 1,000 km to the east. The move that put Mesopotamia inside him did not happen to him. It happened generations before him, and by his lifetime, it had simply become part of what an Egyptian was. The rest of the skeleton kept talking. This was not a young man. He had reached an old age for the time, somewhere past 60, which by itself made him unusual in a world where most people never grew old. His bones carried the wear of a hard physical life. His seat bones, his arms, the way his spine had set, all pointed to a man who spent years bent forward over hard work, pulling, leaning, doing the same motion over and over until it carved itself into him. The researchers raised a quiet, almost cruel irony. The wear matched the pose of a potter, someone who spent his days bent over a wheel shaping wet clay. And this man, maybe a maker of pots, was buried inside a pot, given a tomb cut into solid rock at a time when that kind of burial was saved for people of high standing. Whatever he did with his hands, someone thought he was worth saving. In 2025, a team at the Face Lab in Liverpool took three-dimensional scans of his skull and built his face back layer by layer. The way investigators rebuild the faces of people no one can name. What looked back out of the screen was not a king and not a stranger from another land. It was an ordinary Egyptian man, lined and weathered. The kind of face you could pass in any market on the Nile. An ordinary face hiding a beginning that nobody saw coming. Which brings us to the most famous Egyptian of all, and the Tutankhamun, and the European myth messiest piece of this whole story. Tutankhamun. In 2010, a team led by Zahi Hawass published the results of testing on the royal mummies in the Journal of the American Medical Association. They mapped a family tree. They named Tut's parents as brother and sister, which explained a lot about his weak health. It was careful work on how the bodies were related, but they did not publish the full raw genetic profile, the part outside experts would need to trace deep ancestry. And that gap is where the trouble started. A Swiss company watched a television show about the testing, paused the screen on a chart of genetic markers, and announced that King Tutankhamun belonged to a line called R1b. R1b is most common today in Western Europe, Ireland, Spain, France, Britain. The company claimed that more than half of European men were related to the boy king. The headlines wrote themselves, it was not real. The first researchers called it unscientific. Population scientists pointed out that you cannot read a sure deep ancestry result off a paused television image with only partial data. There is no peer-reviewed proof that Tutankhamun carried that exact European link line. The claim survives online because it is exciting, not because it is true. So set it aside. It is a screenshot, not a finding. But strip away the false European story and you are left with the real one, the one the actual data keeps pointing at. When researchers looked at the deep roots of the markers in Tut's family, the trail ran toward the Near East, toward a source line in the same broad region as Mesopotamia and the Levant, dated tens of thousands of years back. The pharaohs were not European. They were not, in the modern political sense, simply African either. The oldest genetic threads in them keep leading to the same doorway, east, the land between the rivers. And while the gene scientists were carefully refusing to say it, one tradition had been saying it for thousands of years. Step back from the lab for a moment. The gods of the two rivers, look at the map the way an ancient person would have. The two great civilizations of the early world were not facing away from each other. They were facing in Sumer in southern Mesopotamia and Egypt on the Nile. The first writing in both, the first cities in both, the first kings claiming to rule by the power of gods in both. And in Sumer, those gods had a name, the Anunnaki. The Sumerian text described the Anunnaki as the ones who came down, who set up kingship, who handed people the foundations of civilization, and then stepped back to let humans rule in their name. The Egyptians told their own version, gods who ruled on earth before the human pharaohs, a first dynasty that was not human at all. Two peoples split by 1,000 kilometers of desert, both insisting that civilization did not grow slowly from the dirt, both insisting it was handed down from above by beings who came from somewhere else and left bloodlines behind. In 1976, a writer named Zecharia Sitchin took the Sumerian tablets and argued that the Anunnaki were not symbols and not myth, but flesh. Visitors from a planet he called Nibiru, who built humanity. Treat his reading as one take, a much debated one, not as fact. But notice the shape of the question he was asking, because the lab in Liverpool just answered a piece of it without meaning to. Sitchin said, the bloodline of the gods ran from Mesopotamia into the kings of the ancient world. He meant it literally and across the stars. The genome of Nu says something far more down to earth, and in its own way far harder to wave off. A real bloodline really did run out of Mesopotamia into the people who built Egypt. Not from a planet, from the river valley where the Anunnaki stories were first carved into clay. The myth pointed east. The DNA points east. They are not the same claim, but they are pointing at the same horizon. Here is what the old argument got wrong, and it got it wrong on a level deeper than picking the wrong answer. It was using the wrong map African or European. Two boxes drawn by people in the last few centuries, laid backward onto a man who lived before either label existed. He would not have understood the question. His world did not run north to south, Africa against Europe. It ran along the rivers, the Nile and the Tigris and the Euphrates, three ribbons of water that pulled people, goods, gods, and genes back and forth across 1,000 kilometers of land we have spent 200 years pretending was empty. The pharaohs were not African in the way one side wanted and not European in the way the other side insisted. They were something the modern argument never had a box for. A people of the river carrying inside them the blood of the first cities, the cities of Sumer, the cities of the Anunnaki tablets. The truth was not in either of the two answers. It was in the direction nobody was looking. There is a strange piece left over that science has not closed. One genome is one man. The researchers who read him said it themselves, and they are right. You cannot rebuild the whole population of Old Kingdom Egypt from a single skeleton in a pot. Maybe the next genome shows more Mesopotamia. Maybe it shows none. And this man was a rare case. We do not know yet. The Egyptian and international teams are still working, still pulling samples, still trying to read the unreadable. But the keyhole in the doorway now agrees. Two studies 8 years apart. Late Egyptians and early Egyptians both turning the same way. East, toward the rivers, toward Sumer. And the man who proved it never said a word. He sits in his glass case in Liverpool. Still curled in the clay pot they buried him in before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was set. The bombs missed him. The centuries forgot him. And inside his teeth and his bones, he carried the one thing the loudest argument of the modern world could never shout down. A quiet, chemical, cannot be argued fact about where his people came from. Not the answer anyone was fighting for. A stranger one. The pharaohs came from the river that fed the gardens of Sumer. The land the tablets said the Anunnaki walked. We have been arguing about the color of a map. The man in the pot was holding the coordinates the whole time. And we are only now learning how to read.